Welcome everyone to this first subscriber-only online event from the China Project. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Kaiser and I'm joined by my dear colleagues, Jin Yumi, aka Jeremy Goldkorn, and of course Lizzi Lee, who will really be the star of the show today because she is so deeply versed in all the arcana of inter-party politics, and I am sure you will find her insights to be extraordinarily valuable. We'll talk for about 40 minutes about our takeaways from the 20th Party Congress, and then leave time for your questions. So you can add questions into the Q&A tab. So let's get right to it. Jeremy, what do you have? You have some housekeeping?
Yeah, let me first issue a quick plug. Thank you to everybody here for being a subscriber to the China Project. If you are an individual subscriber but work at a company, university, think tank, or other organization that might find our media project informative and useful, we offer group subscriptions at wholesale prices. So please email my colleague Lona, that's Lona, at thechinaproject.com, or subscriptions at thechinaproject.com if you'd like to know more. So on to the meat, or rather the meeting. Last week's gathering was the Chinese Communist Party's 20th National Congress. Such meetings have, since the death of Chairman Mao, been held once every 5 years. And this 5-year period is what the media usually means when it talks about terms served by Chinese government officials, including the General Secretary of the party and the national chairman or president. So, of course, the big deal about the 20th Party Congress was that Xi Jinping is staying on as party leader for the next 5 years, and also presumably as country chairman. But that will only actually presumably happen in spring next year. Making the big deal even bigger this year is the fact that Xi managed to stack the Politburo and its 7-member standing committee with men who are presumed to be extremely loyal to him or beholden to him. And many observers predict this will allow him to rule without any restraints. There was, of course, a piece of video that has come to symbolize Xi's dominance, and I refer, of course, to the unexpected removal or departure of former Secretary General Hu Jintao from the closing ceremony on Saturday. That sparked a storm of speculation online. Some say it was just because he suffers from dementia and was having a senior moment and had to leave to avoid further embarrassment, what Xinhua news agency called health reasons. Others see an intentional humiliation of Hu by Xi Jinping as a display of his power and of the fact that not even party elders can restrain him. Lizzie, what is your take on the whole Hu Jintao exit incident?
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you for our subscribers for tuning in today. I think ultimately people are going to believe what they want to believe, even if we are looking at the same footage. I think ultimately Hu Jintao's, unceremonious departure has more symbolic meaning than what the incident actually tells us. A generational shift in power, and Hu Jintao literally left the center of power, closed up an era in Communist Party power history. I wanted to push back a little bit on the public purge theory I've been hearing from different distant Twitters and other social media accounts. Bearing in mind that the Party Congress is an extremely highly choreographed event, to the extent that there were actual politicking power struggle that happened weeks or even months before last week. And to be honest, this kind of public purge is not really Xi Jinping's personal style. If you know Xi Jinping and use one word to describe him, that would be 有定力. He is a very deliberate, quiet, patient person. Xi Jinping purged lots of his political rivals, as we saw in the last decade, but the way Xi Jinping did that was by building several cases against you, against your prodigies, against your secretaries, against your business associates back in the decades, and then slowly closed in on you, and did that quietly in a background. For example, we saw the case of Sun Lijun and Wang Qishan, very much in this vein. So this is not how Xi Jinping purged his rivals. And further, whatever power Hu Jintao may once possessed inside the party, Hu Jintao was a weak leader to start with, is long gone by this point. And I would argue that the destruction of Youth League faction was already done a decade ago with the purge of Ling Jihua. So, I don't think this is a plausible time for Xi Jinping to to actually publicly humiliate Hu Jintao, the purge interpretation is probably too far. Was it some sort of a subtle power play? I guess I can't rule it out. But my read of it is pretty simple. Hu Jintao is known to be in very poor health. Even when he was pretty young, back in the days when he was in Tibet, he was known to file to the central government to ask for a leave of absence because his health was so poor. And I guess what's so tragic of that scene is we saw this junior staff coax Hu Jintao out of the room as if he was a little baby into leaving. And Hu Jintao's protege Li Qiang was kind of wooden looking straight ahead, not reacting to Hu Jintao's supposedly a health emergency in any meaningful way. It's a dramatic scene, but I think I would caution against reading too much into that.
I think the most sensible comment I saw was perhaps from Wu Guoguang, a scholar interviewed by Yuan Li on her Chinese language podcast. And he said the only thing we can really take away from this is looking at the cold faces of the people that many of whom he had basically, been their superior and helped them in their careers. And they showed him not an iota of respect. There was no politeness. And what we can perhaps tell from this is how cold and lacking in humanity many of the senior leaders are. And that's about as far as we can go, right?
Right.
Well, Li Jianshu did stand up tried to stand up, but Wang Huning kind of tugged at his sleeve and made him sit back down.
Don't be so human. Sit down and be a robot.
Don't be so human.
Right. And actually, I mean, if there's anything surprising, I guess like Hu Jintao's presence on the at the first row of party Congress itself is kind of surprising. I mean, Jiang Zemin was not there, and Hu Jintao is known to be in very poor health. My understanding is that's actually a gesture of appreciation to the party elders. The presence of former leaders is kind of a tradition. We keep that tradition going. It's kind of a mechanism to keep the power relatively smooth and stable within the party's upper echelon. I'm not sure if Hu Jintao will ever appear in future events, but it does seem that his health is not in top shape.
Well, I'm glad that we've got that topic behind us now, and we can move on to the real things. Jeremy mentioned that a lot of observers now predict that because he's run the table, there's this new lineup that he's going to be able to rule without any meaningful restraints, which makes me want to ask you, Lizzie, do you think that Xi Jinping was meaningfully constrained before the 20th Party Congress? I mean, do you believe that there really was any significant opposition to him? Because from where I sit, it seems like many of us may have wished that there were, but it never really amounted to anything, even if it existed, nothing that we could see, certainly. So I'm wondering whether this idea that Xi will be more free to pursue his own agenda really means anything at all. And I mean, he was already perfectly free to do so. To me, this isn't a lurch in a different direction at all. It just simply represents, in the main, more continuity. What's your take on that?
Right. I think that's really the critical question. And, I think it really wasn't. I mean, especially in the spring, we saw this talk of pushback from Li Qiang, the premier, but there was never really any evidence that there was any, speaking truth to power, any, power to constrain Xi Jinping's, economic policy course, any course correction. There was no evidence on that whatsoever. I think it's true that Li Qiang was not Xi Jinping's premier of choice, and Xi Jinping doesn't seem to think particularly highly of Li Qiang. But to me, Li Qiang is like the pair of shoes, half a size too small for Xi Jinping. Yes, those shoes might create some discomfort, but you can still walk with them, and your shoes are not going to revolt and kill you. And this time around, Xi Jinping get a chance to actually pick his top choice, and that one's not going to be Li Qiang. I think that's as simple as that. And it's also important to remember that during Xi Jinping's first term in office, he actually revamped the economic policy ecosystem in China. Previously, policy designing happened within the State Council, the 国务院. But during Xi Jinping's first term, he actually shifted lots of policymaking power to the so-called party leading groups, 中共中央领导小组. They're all chaired by Xi Jinping himself. And that didn't happen recently. That happened way back in Xi Jinping's first term. And if you read Superpower Showdown, a book I highly recommend by Ling Wei and Bob Davis, in Xi Jinping's earlier years, there was some rumors of North-South dispute. South of Zhongnanhai refers to the CPC Central Committee. North of Zhongnanhai refers to the State Council in terms of how economic policies, should work. But that had long been resolved. So to the extent that Xi Jinping has significantly consolidated his power, even during the first term of his office, I don't think, by the end of his last term, there was any significant force of countering Xi Jinping within the party echelon.
I mean, I think it was 2014 when Jeremy Barmay coined the phrase "chairman of everything" to refer to Xi, and it was after those small leading groups were all set up. And I have to say, I've been answering questions about before the party congress about like a lot of the speculation. It doesn't really matter because who cares who's on the Politburo Standing Committee? There's only one guy in charge. But it does feel like he's much more in charge, no? But let's talk about some of the other people, Lizzie. What should we know about the new premier, Li Qiang? He may share two characters in his name in common with the outgoing premier, Li Qiang, but the difference between them is more than a ke, you could say.
Right. And those names are going to confuse lots of people. Li Qiang, Li Qiang, Li Xi, Xi Jinping, Liu He, Li Feng. I mean, who knows who are these people, right? But if there's one person that we should pay more attention to within the Politburo Standing Committee members, I think it is Li Qiang. But not in the sense that he's going to provide any course correction to Xi Jinping's policymaking, but to the extent that Li Qiang will be the implementer in chief of Xi Jinping's economic policy goals, Li Qiang is still worth taking a closer look at. So as I mentioned, previously there was this North-South dispute on who is the highest authority to run economic policy. It was resolved. CPC Working Committee is the ultimate designer of policy with Xi Jinping at the top of many of the working groups. So State Council really doesn't matter that much in terms of deciding the direction of policy, but it will implement many of the major policies Xi Jinping made or designed with his group of advisors. And Li Qiang will, in a weird way, have more influence than his predecessor Li Qiang because Xi Jinping actually trusts him. And I hear this in media a lot that Li Qiang is basically just one of Xi Jinping's acolytes. He's gonna do whatever Xi Jinping directs him to do. I would actually argue the opposite. I guess this is a minority view. To the extent that Li Qiang and Xi Jinping shares that trust, Li Qiang might feel more comfortable giving his honest assessment of things to Xi Jinping. So to that extent, Li Qiang might, on the margin, push Xi Jinping's policy into more pro-business, pro-market direction if Li Qiang feels comfortable enough.
That's a very optimistic view, Lizzie, I have to say.
Right. That's a contrarian view, but I don't want to rule it out, actually.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Let me follow up on that. So he gets quite a bit of heat, especially in the Western reporting that I've seen, for his association with the poorly managed Shanghai lockdowns of the spring. Is there more to him than that? What else should we know about the man?
Right. So, from what I know about Li Qiang, there are really multiple facets to this person, as you would expect of any Chinese bureaucrats or any person. So if we look at Chinese media's portrayal of Li Qiang's early career in the coastal provinces of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Shanghai, those are the three most developed areas in China, the industrial base, the commercial hubs. He actually had a pro-business reputation among many of the executives, the business communities back then. So Li Qiang actually oversaw the opening of the Star Market in Shanghai. He was also the person who welcomed the first factory of Tesla in Shanghai. And when he was in Zhejiang, he championed this so small town business focusing on the harmony between economics and environment. And that model was later sort of propagated across nation as a model of success. So if you talk to business people, talk to executives, they actually speak pretty highly of Li Qiang. So that's the one thing that I will say about Li Qiang. He seems to be a pragmatic bureaucrat who doesn't have that kind of charismatic leadership, but seems able to work with business leaders and multinational executives to help them and to develop it's the business of Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Shanghai. But a word of caution is Xi Jinping was also known for being pro-business when he was in Zhejiang. So, we'll just wait and see. I guess the part that's lacking in Li Qiang's experience is central. He has never had any central position, and he has never had any position outside of those coastal provinces. So that's going to be a challenge for Li Qiang. But Li Keqiang, his predecessor, had his provincial career in the backwater of China, in Liaoning. So is Li Qiang more qualified or Li Keqiang more qualified? I guess you can argue both ways. And in terms of the lack of central governance experience, I think Li Qiang is going to get a crash course very soon. Actually, the first standing committee of NPC meeting is taking place right now. It's going to last until the end of this week. And after that, people usually think that Li Qiang will get a first round of promotion to vice premier. So Li Qiang will have a crash course of 3 months. It's kind of like a winter internship for Li Qiang to get familiarized with how things work in state council, and whether Li Qiang can be a successful premier kind of depends on how fast he can learn the inner working of the government agencies under state council. So there's hope for Li Qiang.
Lots of optimism there. Lizzie, just now you mentioned the name of one province many times. That's Zhejiang. You mentioned, of course, that Xi Jinping spent some time there. The new Politburo Standing Committee is full of people who have spent quite a bit of time in their formative years in that same province. Let's talk about some of the others who served with Xi back from his Zhejiang days. One of his oldest associates is Cai Qi, who was party chief in Taizhou and then the mayor of Hangzhou during the time that Xi himself ran Zhejiang. He was as party secretary. So what can you tell us about Cai Qi and about whether it's meaningful now to speak of a Zhejiang clique, a Zhejiang faction?
Right. So I would just open by saying that I'm not a fan of Cai Qi. If you remember, in 2017, just a few weeks after the 19th Party Congress, there was this public anger arise in Beijing because of the forced eviction of migrant workers on Beijing's outskirts. And if you are someone who's from Beijing, those migrant workers are crucial to how Beijing is run. And they're in construction, they're in service industry. They're really kind of the blood cells of Beijing. And there were images and videos of homes being demolished by public security officials. And there was this leaked video online showing Cai Qi, personally directing the operation, saying that we should see some blood on the knives, 刺刀见红, using that kind of fascist language. So I'll be upfront. I'm personally not a fan of Cai Qi, but surprisingly, Cai Qi actually weathered the storm of public anger. And there was this kind of public reconciliation between Cai Qi and some of the other migrant worker community, and Cai Qi seemed to survive that period of controversy. Speaking of Cai Qi's career, he's kind of a late bloomer, actually. He's already 66 years old this time around. And if you look at people's predictions prior to the 20th Party Congress, Cai Qi was not high on people's list for the standing committee. But Cai Qi, indeed, as Kaiser mentioned, is one of Xi Jinping's closest political allies, not just in Zhejiang, but starting in Fujian, which is kind of the even earlier part of Xi Jinping's career. And Cai Qi made multiple dramatic leaps of promotions during his career. In 2017, he actually jumped directly to the Politburo without making a first stop at the Central Committee. So that was kind of surprising. And this time he jumped directly into the Politburo Standing Committee. So what do we know about Cai Qi? So Cai Qi and Xi Jinping overlapped a little bit in Fujian. And Cai Qi had this reputation for having this sense of filial piety. According to accounts back then, Cai Qi was usually seen kind of walking around with his mom holding hands. And if you know Xi Jinping is also extremely respectful of Qixin, his mom. So maybe that's how they two connect. We don't know. But Cai Qi is known to have that respect for his mom. Cai Qi was also, right. Cai Qi was also a avid social media user. That's kind of unexpected to me. But back in the age of Weibo, Cai Qi had something like 6 million followers on Weibo. And people call him Cai Shu, so Uncle Cai. And he would write those, witty small paragraphs on Weibo. He closed down his Weibo after he was promoted to Beijing. So we don't know whether he still uses social media these times. He might be lurking on Twitter somewhere. We don't know. And he also wrote a blog for Caixin. It's already been taken down. But one article that's particularly interesting was his a diary of his Taiwan trip. He praised those bookstores in Taiwan, said they were super well organized, very clean, very modern. Mainland stores should learn from the Taiwanese bookstores. He praised 7-Eleven convenience stores in Taiwan. It was all amazing to Cai Qi. So that was kind of interesting to me. And it's
those are the most important things that Taiwan has really innovated.
7-Eleven.
7-Eleven.
He's not alone in that opinion, actually.
No, I don't know.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, so that's what we know about Cai Qi in public. I think, we'll see what he's like when he's in the standing committee, whether he's more like the demolishing, evicting Beijing migrants Cai Qi, or the social media avid user Cai Qi. We'll see.
Well, Hitler was a painter who was also vegetarian.
Good point.
So I don't,
Right.
Hey, well, one quick question to throw in here. I mentioned, like a Zhejiang clique, but there's another sort of faction that people have been talking quite a bit about in the run up to the party congress. It was pretty easy to see that a lot of people who were getting promotions came out of a background from Beihang, from the former Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. They were being promoted to top provincial spots and in various ministries. And so there was a lot of talk about a Beihang clique.
Right.
Has this played out well in the 20th Party Congress selections?
Absolutely, yes. I think if there's one thing that's clear, it's the emphasis on STEM, science and technology. It's not just in the new lineup of Politburo, but if you look at the policy making committee, the central committee, there are lots of STEM grads there. By my account, I think there are 6 Politburo members who had qualification, advanced degrees in science and technology this time around, and their expertise. Some are, we have the cosmos sciences, Ma Xingrui and Zhejiang Secretary Yuan Jiajun, and we also have people specialized in public health. This is in Li, and we have Li Ganjie and Beijing Mayor Chen Jining, who are both quite young by Communist Party standard. Li Ganjie is 57, Chen Jining is 57 too. They are both environmental experts. And Chen Jining actually did a stellar job in Beijing, cleaning up pollutions and stuff. I think, Beijing used to have this reputation for being super polluted. You wouldn't be able to breathe in the air, but now it's much better. I think that's a consensus among Beijing residents and environmental specialists. So speaking of Li, who's also a important bureaucrat who's probably going to be promoted to one of the provinces as party secretary, either Shanghai or Guangdong, as I heard, or even vice premier if it's lucky. He is a world-renowned public health expert. So I think the promotion of those STEM grads really is significant for China. I think Xi Jinping himself has greater trust in those who have served in the aerospace and defense sectors in those STEM fields, in particular, because those fields did deliver impressive results for China in the past years, the space station, the Mars mission, et cetera. And those STEM grads, those technocrats, are known to be relatively simple in terms of their political affiliations, and they are more pragmatic relative to career bureaucrats. So I joke with my friends, this is really the time for nerd in China. I think we are going to see more public funding, more investment, more policy support to STEM education, and we're going to see more promotion from STEM fields into the bureaucracy.
Of course.
Lizzie, I actually joked 22 years ago now, in an essay I wrote about technocracy, and I called China the land of nerd empowerment. And And the title of that piece, it was for Time Asia. It was The Revenge of the Nerds. So
I
yeah,
see.
it's all.
Yeah, but like I think like in Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao's time, it's more on like hydropower. We have the hydropower clique, the geology clique, but now it's more the Beihang clique, the cosmo
the rocket
very different.
scientists,
Yes, the rocket
clique.
science, literal rocket sciences.
So, Lizzie, one of the two men who remained on the Politburo Standing Committee did actually work for Hu Jintao, and in fact worked for Jiang Zemin too. And this is, of course, Wang Huning, who draws a lot of attention from China watchers. He's sometimes characterized as Xi Jinping's brain, and the chief ideologue. What's your view of his importance in this leadership? And to add a question from one of our attendees, he rose by one rank. What, if anything, do you think this promotion will mean in practice? Because it seems like he was already extremely influential.
Right. So as you pointed out, Wang Huning was one of the two holdovers from the previous standing committee. He seems to be in line for Zheng Xie. So it's kind of a ceremonial legislative chairs. The ranking in the PPC is I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it. Right. Ren Da and Zheng Xie typically come before vice premier, but executive vice premier is arguably a more important role. So I think Wang Huning is here to provide some sense of continuity across his generations. I wouldn't read too much into his rank per se. What's really interesting and surprising, I think, this time around is actually on the ideology front, Xi Jinping didn't get the maximum fruits that people were talking about. For example, we just saw the Xinhua News Agency released this revised party constitution. We didn't see two establishments, 两个确立. We didn't see people's leader, 人民领袖, which will elevate Xi Jinping's road to Mao Zedong to at the level of party constitution. And also this horribly named Xi Jinping's ideology framework, Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, didn't get truncated down to Xi Jinping thought, which would have been a elevation of Xi Jinping's ideology. So if Xi Jinping didn't score 100% on this whole party congress thing, I think he fell short on ideology relative to people's prediction. So what does that actually mean? So I'm not sure what the correct answer is, but I think we're going to see more consolidation in terms of ideology in the next 5 years. And I keep hearing from China experts and people who talk to the Chinese administration that they want to provide a comprehensive framework to solve this legitimacy issue. Whether we will see more movement forward, progress on that front, I think we'll wait to see. But to the extent that ideology is important to Xi Jinping, which I think is true, I think Wang Huning will play a role. Another surprise is the person in charge of party affairs taking over Wang Huning's portfolio is actually Cai Qi, the person we just mentioned, the previous Beijing party chief. But to my understanding, Cai Qi didn't really have much experience here, so we're not quite sure how Cai Qi is going to do it. Wang Huning will probably be a background advisor to Cai Qi, as far as I can tell. That's one of the predictions I got wrong. I thought if there's one person who will take over Wang Huning's portfolio on party affairs and ideology, it could have been Huang Kunming, but apparently Cai Qi was the person to do that. So lots of things we don't know yet, but I think on the ideology front, we'll see some movement in the next 5 years.
So, Lizzie, how about Ding Xiang?
Right.
I mean, he's 60, right? So
right.
On the younger end, what does that tell us anything?
So that's a good question.
The heir apparent.
Yeah, so Ding Qiang is only 60, which is not young by any standard, but it's the youngest person in the seven-person standing committee. It's a little surprising and odd that Ding Qiang, with no governing experience, was promoted to the executive vice premier role. So the only way I can think of to read that is it's a way for Ding Qiang to get some government experience, to get familiarized with all the agencies within the state council, effectively grooming him probably to be the next premier, 5 years after this round. But again, lots of things can happen in 5 years, so I'm not by any means certain on that. But Ding Xuexiang, to the extent that Xi Jinping is thinking about the next generation of leaders, I think Ding Xuexiang is pretty high up there on the list.
Lizzie, you once floated this idea that really intrigued me at the time that you said it, that a lot of party cadres who were in their 30s and in their 40s during the Hu and Wen era in the aughts. This was, in a period where their career advancement was really important, that when they were really getting established. They're now in their 50s and maybe even into their early 60s. They should be prime candidates for advancement, but the idea that you said was that there's a belief that they're all too tainted by the corruption of that era. And that we're seeing something under Xi right now that's like generation skipping. Can you elaborate a little bit on that idea? And did you see evidence supporting or refuting that hypothesis during this recent party congress?
Right. I think you're absolutely right. Chinese leaders come in generations, and their outlook about the world in China are heavily shaped and colored by their personal experience. For example, the 50s generation, this is Xi Jinping's generation, they experienced the Great Famine in the late 50s and early 60s, and many of them were sent young youth in their teens, and they experienced Cultural Revolution in their 20s. That's sort of the early life of their the early years of their life. And the 60s generation are very different, and these are the people who came of age at the reform and opening period. They spent their entire career under the Jianghu era, which experienced lots of the Jianghu era, lots of market reforms, relative prosperity, but also rampant corruption, and this economic growth model that was not sustainable from a contemporary perspective. The 70s and 80s generation didn't experience much political instability. By the time they were in their 30s, the tumultuous era of Chinese politics of the 80s had already passed. So they tend to come with a clean slate, if you can say so. And they tend to, they are the generation that experienced China's rise, and they know the world, but they didn't, I would say they didn't worship the West in a way that the previous generation did. And to the extent that Xi Jinping is already well in his 60s, and this generation of Chinese leaders are all in their 60s, I don't think any of the 60 generation are going to be the next generation of leaders. By the time 5 years later, they're going to be late in their 60s. So if Xi Jinping stay on scene for a decade, the next generation of Chinese leaders are probably going to be the Zhuge Yujies of China, who were born in the 70s and 80s. So to the extent that we're going to skip a full generation because Xi Jinping stays in power for more than 2 terms, hopefully only 4 terms.
You say you're an optimist again. You think it's going to skip 1 generation?
Here's the thing. I mean, it sounds tongue in cheek, but I honestly don't think the idea that Xi Jinping is determined to stay on for life is correct. I mean, if anything, so this is just my conjecture. I think internally there has to be some sort of plan for Xi Jinping to exit the scene. I don't think the party apparatus is going to buy into the idea that we are going to abolish any plan of succession. It's not. It's just not an acceptable plan, and it's not a safe plan. What if something happens to Xi Jinping's health, as we saw in Hu Jintao, a few days ago at the closing ceremony of the party congress? So that's my take.
Okay, well,
Jeremy, I just got to get this in. I mean, there's no love for creatures of the Jianghu like us. But the other thing I gotta say is that I'm feeling very slighted both in America and in China, because my generation's getting skipped in both. I mean, Gen X is being completely bypassed for the American presidency too. We're not going to see. Yeah,
it's millennials. Yeah, I know. Speaking of optimists, there were people who, had theories about Li Qiang and Wang Yang. And in fact, what happened was they were both removed from the Central Committee. And they were both under the informal retirement age, informal mandatory
Right.
retirement age of 68. So what do we know, or what can you speculate about Wang Yang and Li Qiang's early exit?
Right. So, I mean, I will admit that that's something I didn't expect.
Right.
I think I anticipated there will be some relaxation of the 七上八下age rule, but I thought it would be in the other direction. I thought someone older than 68 would stay on, and my guess was that the person was going to be Han Zheng.
Yeah.
That seems more. More like if you're gonna break the rule, that's sort of the predictable way to break it. But that's actually the opposite. Han Zheng left as expected, but we also saw two early exit. Wang Yang and Li Qiang. There was this article from Chinese state media Xinhua that got published yesterday, which is kind of interesting. It sort of gives this timeline of how the new generation of leaders were selected. And the state media praised, quote, some party and state leaders for voluntarily stepping down to make way for younger talent. That seems like a reference to the retirement of Li Qiang and Wang Yang. Were they actually volunteering to retire, or they thought it was the best way for them to exit the scene decently? We don't know, but without naming Wang Yang and Li Qiang, that seems to be a indirect reference to the two. But let me just put in a caveat here. I mean, nowadays I hear lots of talks for Li Qiang and Wang Yang being pro-market, being reform-minded leaders. I don't think that's actually accurate. I mean, if you look back to the Tuanpai years, the Youth League years of Hu Wen, and if you look at people's commentary back then, I think most would agree that the Hu Wen's decade was probably the worst decade, or the most disappointing decade in Chinese history. There was rampant corruption, there was this debt built up, and Hu Jintao was known to be the weakest Chinese leader for many years. I think people generally treated Hu Jintao with disappointment back then. And the Youth League was never this kind of force toward market reform that people seem to believe these days. Even Hu Chunhua, people talk about Hu Zhenhua as if he would have been the counterforce to Xi Jinping's concentration of power. That just doesn't bear out in reality in any sense. So you can call Li Qiang, Wang Yang moderates, I guess. I mean, both are very mild-mannered leaders who seem to have a good reputation among the Chinese bureaucrats, and Wang Yang seems to be a very charismatic speaker, but I wouldn't call them reform-minded people. And I don't think their exit from the scene was, the sort of the ultimate struggle between the reform faction and the Stalinist, the statist faction. I don't think that's the correct way to read it. But it was a surprise for me to see them both exiting earlier than expected.
I think a lot of observers refuse to admit that the Communist Party is actually made up of communists. Is a long-standing problem. But I mean, on the other hand, Lizzie, like Wang Yang, it used to be called the cake debate. Wang Yang and in Guang'an and Bo Xilai, and Bo Xilai was sort of the more state-directed approach, and Wang Yang supposedly was using markets to grow the cake. So it's not totally unreasonable to have an interpretation like the one you just rejected.
But I mean, I would caution against reading too much into those catchphrases. If you read Xi Jinping's own speech, he still talks about making the cake large enough as a priority of the party. But Xi Jinping, as we know, in terms of economic preferences, is very much in the redistribution part of it. So I wouldn't read too much into those things. But I will say one thing. I think Wang Yang is a terrific public speaker, and it's kind of rare these days. So I was, researching on Wang Yang a little bit back then. Apparently he made this joke, which I thought was perfect, on US-China relationship, on how US and China are like husbands and wife having relationship issues. They can fight all day long, but it's better not to get divorced, because the pain for getting a divorce is going to be so huge. They're going to have to divide up all their assets as Deng Wendi and Motoka's public divorce. So I thought that was it's a quip, but it speaks to Wang Yang's spontaneity, which is kind of rare among Chinese officials these days.
Right. I fear the divorce because of the impact on the kids of that relationship, like me.
Right.
Hey, so I wanted to, as you were saying, because of his own economic policy predilections, Xi Jinping, I mean, it's quite clear that the new leadership has kind of accepted, perforce, that the era of really, really rapid economic growth is kind of over. that was the metric on which people were evaluated for party promotion. You know, how did the GDP of whatever region you were responsible for grow? If that is no longer going to be the performance metric, what is? I mean, with all this emphasis on catching up in critical technologies, addressing this crisis brought on by, you know, the export ban on October 7th, do you think that there's going to be a new emphasis on delivering technological progress? Is that going to be like a new major performance metric?
And just before you answer that, Lizzie, we have 2 questions in the queue. We've reached nearly 40 minutes. So please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A tab and we will get to them after this one.
Fantastic. I think I agree. GDP growth is not going to be a primary metric for promotion. I think we will be back to the days of 又红又专, red and expert. Red meaning loyalty, ideology, ideology purity, so to speak, and 专 expert means expertise, whether you actually have the background and knowledge to do your job. And I think much of the focus is going to be on delivering results, and how to measure that results is a different matter. But I do think the red and expert, 红专, are going to be the 2 criteria. If I can advise Xi Jinping, I would ask another criteria, which is public speaking. I think lots of Chinese bureaucrats do need to take a crash course on how to talk to media, how to properly talk to the outside world. Because I think the international media and also the think tank community understands China very poorly, not just because China is inherently difficult to understand, but also because the messaging from China is especially bad. If all Chinese officials do is just reading from a script, the outside world is not going to decipher China, however hard they try. So I really think Chinese officials should embrace this idea of talking directly to media and just talk like a normal person, not just some drone reading from a prepared remark. That's my suggestion. So red, expert in public speaking.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great.
So we have a question that I think you probably would like to answer, Kaiser, from Stuart Schoenberger. We'd love to hear your views on USA-PRC relationship in the future and a focus on what this means for Taiwan.
Yeah, so I think that we can look at a couple of things and come up with a very easy kind of response to that. I mean, one thing that's obvious is that all the people in the United States who've insisted on casting the relationship as an ideological contest between, if you want, democracy and authoritarianism, democracy and communism, they're going to be given a whole lot of oxygen by the fact that this leadership, this new leadership group seems to be so obviously tilting in that ideological direction. But let me add one thing to that, which is, I mean, this is very depressing because this only sort of furthers the downward spiral. Let's ask ourselves, what the hell did we expect? I mean, after 5 years of this kind of full court press coming from the United States, which is in turn, of course, in response to a lot of things from China, but this proximate 5 years from the Chinese perspective, let me emphasize, it looks like, the United States has put its knee on China's neck and has just been increasingly hostile. Is that going to be conducive to a leadership that's going to say, oh, wow, yeah, this would be a terrific opportunity now to get more, to have a more, deliberately kind of, decentralized rule? No, of course not. It's going to become more authoritarian and more dictatorial in response to what it sees as an existential national security crisis. On Taiwan.
What about Taiwan? Yeah.
So on
Lizzie,
Taiwan,
I'd like to hear your views on this too.
Yeah, I think that, so there's nothing really changed. I mean, there's nothing changed in the language that's what I would say is that there's one phrase that was really conspicuously missing in Xi Jinping's opening speech, and that was 战略机遇期, which is a period of strategic opportunity. That was missing. He does not describe it as a period of strategic opportunity. And I think, he'd be gaslighting everyone collectively if he did, because it's obviously not for China. I think that I've kind of long held that actually Xi's having arrogated to, and this I've said this for a while now, arrogated to himself so much power that he has no one else to blame should he attempt some sort of adventurism across the Taiwan Strait and things didn't go what was planned. If he gets a bloody nose, there's nobody he can blame. I think it's actually a curb on adventurism and not a goad to adventurism.
You're an optimist. You really are an optimist, Kaiser.
I
Let's
just
move
think,
on.
I mean, yeah, there's just no evidence that they're going to try anything. I mean, they're so chastened by what they've seen happen in the rest of the world.
That could be. Let's move on to some economic questions. Let me try and collapse two questions. We got one from Eve and one from somebody anonymous about economic growth. How can we talk about zero COVID? I mean, Eve says, as far as we know, 2022 is the first time that the middle class is very angry and their lives totally uncertain day to day. And I think the three of us all have, friends in Shanghai who, used to drive Ferraris and are now talking about immigrating. So how long can China continue with this self-inflicted pain is the one question. And then to tie in the question from Mr. Anonymous or Ms. Anonymous is how long can the economy continue to serve the needs of the Chinese leadership, given the sort of depressing data coming out of the country?
Right. So let me just try to answer the zero COVID policy. First thing is we really don't know. If you read the party Congress statement from Xi Jinping, you would think, well, all hopes are lost, right? So he suggested zero COVID policy was a success. Doesn't mean we're going to do zero COVID forever. Again, I'm the optimistic person here. The party Congress really is not an occasion for announcing major policy change. To the extent that there will be some relaxation for zero COVID, we're going to have to wait until December. That's when the economic work conference, 经济工作会议, takes place. To the extent that there will be major changes in economic policies, that's the occasion that we'll hear more. So the party Congress really is it's kind of the Communist Party's reunion. It's for the party to celebrate itself, giving commencement speech, that kind of stuff. So no major policy change on zero COVID. That's disappointing, but it's not a surprise. So I do see, I would say, encouraging signals in terms of relaxing travel quarantine rules for foreign executives. And we see this new trial vaccination program going on in Shanghai. So there is hope, but to get a definite answer, I think we will need to wait a little more, 1 to 2 months until the economic work conference. And in terms of economic performance, I think China is in a very bad shape now. In the short term, it's mostly because of the zero COVID policy, but in the midterm and the longer term, I think the property market slump and China's population structural problem are going to be the more crucial ones. And how Xi Jinping and this administration plans to solve them, we don't know yet. But as far as zero COVID policy goes, we're going to have to give it a few weeks of time to see what will eventually happen.
Also, I love you, Eve, but the middle class is not fully represented by the people of Shanghai.
Yeah,
that's not the totality of the Chinese middle class. And to say that they're all angry, people in Shanghai certainly were angry, absolutely. There's this great line that David Rennie gave at the end of the Prince podcast, where he talked about China as kind of this grand utilitarian experiment, where really what they're doing is they're weighing. Look, I mean, they're looking across the strait right now. They're seeing 46,000 cases a day right now in Taiwan. As soon as Taiwan basically lifted its zero COVID policy, and they're seeing simply an unacceptable number of deaths. They think that there's a political downside to the lockdowns. There's probably, they think, a worse one to, if they simply allowed it to burn rampantly through an immunologically naive population like China's is.
But there is something that is extremely unutilitarian in the whole approach, is that what about vaccines? Approach to vaccines
they're trying their best. Like, what you're asking for is more like full-blown coercion, right? To get those old people who realize they have as much chance of getting COVID as they do of being struck by lightning to take a jab that they know will make them feel sick for a couple of days. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. I know, I mean, my family's got relatives there who will not get the vaccine for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not, I mean, it's just really bizarre to me how we sit here and we seem to have converged on this idea that, there's nothing, sensible at all about taking a more aggressive approach to COVID. And I just think that doesn't take into account, the actual conditions in China.
Okay. There we have it.
Well,
What
there's
about another question?
Let me actually ask Lizzie something that combines with the economic questions that we had, and I think this is really important because there were a couple of changes in the lineup that came that I think are really interesting. We don't know who the new lieutenants are going to be who are overseeing China's economic development. We had Qin Gang, who was the head of what's it called, the Financial Stability and Development Council, and then Qing, who headed the CBRC and then the combined CBIRC. They're both stepping down. Who is going to replace them, and what manner of economic policy do you think that they're going to pursue?
Right. So in terms of PBOC, the Central Bank of China, I've heard chatters from multiple people that Yin Yong, the current vice mayor of Beijing, will take over. It seems to have been confirmed, at least tangentially confirmed by multiple international media. So Yin Yong, not to be confused, but with Yin Yong, the Hubei guy who oversaw the original the outbreak of COVID. So Yin Yong is only 53 years old, by the way, and relatively young in the Chinese bureaucracy. Seems like his chance of becoming PBOC governor is quite strong here. He had a PhD from Tsinghua. He had a MPA, I believe, from Harvard. He also spent his early career managing CIC, China's sovereign wealth fund, in its Singapore office. So he's quite experienced there. And Yin Yong is known to be a career finance and economics official. He also was promoted in 2015 to be the current governor of PBOC, Yi Gang's, basically top aide, and he was only 46 then, which was a surprise, and he was one of the youngest people who got the position as deputy governor of PBOC. So he's known for currency management skills. He has lots of experience on that front. In public, he seems to be this mild-mannered person who keeps a low profile. I think PBOC management will be in good hands if Yi Gang is the person who takes over. And another name people mention is Liu He's successor, He Lifeng. I think it's pretty certain that it will be He Lifeng. So Liu He, as you know, is a person who led trade negotiations with the United States back in 2018. And Liu He is already 70 years old. Liu He is bound to retire now. He Lifeng is also a veteran manager of economic affairs in China. He's currently in the NDRC, so that's the National Development and Reform Commission, basically overseeing state plans and major state investment projects. Some people argue that He Lifeng will probably favor a more statist approach to economic management. I think the prior reasoning for that was He Lifeng spent a decent amount of his career in Tianjin when Tianjin saw the infrastructure boom. But I would, again, caution against that simple logic, right? Spending a few years in Tianjin during infrastructure boom, which is happening across China, was probably not a very good indicator, a very sharp indicator of He Lifeng's own economic policy. But in terms of personal style, He Lifeng is very much in the same vein of Liu He, professional economic bureaucrats. So I think Liu He and He Lifeng and Yin Yong are the no surprise candidates. But again, those positions won't be fully reviewed until next March. So we'll see the full details in the months to come.
Lizzie, following up on that, our subscriber Benjamin Wasserstrom asks a very good question. What about youth unemployment, which we're seeing at quite high levels right now, sort of frighteningly high levels? What do you think the party intends to do to try to resolve this problem?
Right. So youth unemployment, as we know, is close to 20%, which is extremely high for China and extremely by international standard, actually. And I think the primary reason in the short term is zero COVID. Zero COVID affect service industry the most, and youth employment are heavily concentrated in service industry. So to the extent that zero COVID will relax next year, hopefully by September, which is the year of job hunt, the month of job hunting for Chinese college graduates, I think we're going to see some improvement in terms of employment number. And in the short term, it's hard to see the the best solution or the gold solution for the Chinese government. I think, the ultimate way out of this is the relaxation of zero COVID. But I think I concur with Kaiser. There's lots of discussion. I think we need to respect, at least to some extent, the Chinese government's, choice to be cautious in terms of opening up, because China China has a significant percentage of elder population, and if you see what happened in Taiwan, it's hard to avoid uptick in death rate if China opens up abruptly. So how China manage that is really a challenge for China. I don't think there's one correct answer. I think it's going to be a gradual process of adjustment.
I suppose where I have to push back against the two of you is that the trouble with China is that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, is that the tendency is always to more control, never to less control. And at least it has been since Xi Jinping has been in power. So as much as you can understand and sympathize with the idea that, there are some realities they're dealing with, there is also something else at work. And something that is extremely dysfunctional. And you might have all the sympathy in the world for them, but the position China is in right now, China made that position. I mean, people talk about hospitals being overwhelmed. I mean, I come from South Africa. We don't have a great healthcare system over there at all. And they took a very different approach and are now having very different results. So yes, one should have what Kaiser likes to call, I suppose, cognitive empathy for where they're coming from. But I don't think that makes the response completely reasonable.
You play the hand you're dealt. What they're looking at right now is a situation where vaccination rates among the elderly are low, 65% perhaps, where there is ample evidence that if you take your hand off, this thing goes wild, and that even though hospitalizations and deaths are much lower than under the Delta variant, they'll be significant. They estimate 1.5–2 million deaths. They don't think that's politically acceptable. This is one of those cases where, cultural variables actually matter, where it actually does, this filial piety and this respect for the aged actually does factor into their decision making. So yeah, I mean, you have to play the hand you're dealt. You can't go back in time, Jeremy, and
you can't. But they dealt their own hands, so you can't just it's not like
I don't know that that's entirely true either. I mean,
yeah,
I think
if
they made decisions that were rational in the time that they made them, and from the very beginning, the situation that China faced was very, very different. Let's
take one more question. We just have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I don't see any others that are on this list that we have.
What about Qin Gang? We didn't get to Qin Gang.
Right, yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. So what does it mean that Qin Gang was named? So he's obviously the ambassador to the United States. He follows, there have been other people who have served as ambassador to the United States, Wang Yi, for example, who have then, was it Yang Jiechi? Who was ambassador to the US? Was it Wang Yi or Yang Jiechi?
Yang Jiechi. During the Bush years, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yang Jiechi was, and now during the Bush administration. So he's now, I mean, there's precedent for this. So do you think that Qin Gang is in line for a state council position for as state councilor, or do you think he is eventually going to be to head the foreign ministry?
I think it's pretty clear, or at least from my assessment, that Qin Gang will get a promotion, whether it's the foreign minister of China, we'll wait and see. But clearly, Qin Gang is in for a big promotion, as far as I can tell. And so it's interesting if you look at the top Chinese diplomats, right? So currently it's Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi. Yang Jiechi is retired, and Wang Yi stays on, despite the fact that Wang Yi is already 69 years old. So I think the retention of Wang Yi is a move toward stability, right? There are lots of things happening in the world. The war between Russia and Ukraine, and the international system is undergoing fundamental change. So Wang Yi is the force of stability. What is the other person who will be promoted to Wang Yi's position at this point? So Liu Jieyi was the top candidate, but Liu Jieyi is out of the Central Committee. So it seems like, yes, Qin Gang is definitely high up in there as a top candidate to take over Wang Yi's job. What does it mean in terms of U.S.-China relations? I actually don't know. But Kaiser, you have interacted with the Chinese embassy officials in there, and you had a podcast episode with one of the consulate members, right?
Yeah.
What's your read of Qin Gang?
So, obviously that was a sensitive question. They didn't, they typically don't. I mean, I remember when I interviewed Huang Ping, who is the actual consul general to the New York consulate. The one question that they didn't want me to ask was, to talk about the challenges that Qin Gang faces as ambassador. He didn't want to step into that at all. And when I talked to Xu Zhuyuan, she wasn't interested in talking about, other individuals there, just talking about the U.S.-China relationship more broadly. So I don't know whether that was, they had a heads up that, that Qin Gang was being tapped for something more. I have not interacted personally with Qin himself, but I think that he is definitely somebody who represents a slightly harder line in Chinese foreign policy. He has said some things that have, not been in politics, but I think he's done a fairly good job, I think, as ambassador in very, very challenging circumstances. And I wouldn't class him as a full-blown wolf warrior diplomat, but he's no pushover either.
Yeah. Actually, I was quite impressed when he went on live TV. I think it's CBS Face the Nation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was kind of stiff, but I'm actually quite impressed that he, took the time to explain China's position. He was a little stiff, but yeah.
I mean, relatively speaking, he would. Right. I mean, he was not stiff at all compared to most of his colleagues.
They always are. They always are.
Right.
I don't think you get that job without being stiff.
Yeah,
unless you're Wang.
If you're adequately stiff, you're considered. You see any looseness at all,
any spontaneity, you're not really allowed to rise through the ranks of the Communist Party. Yeah, no, or you get it beaten out of you at some point. On that delightful note, which at least enables me to inject some negativity into this conversation, I think we should wrap up because we've reached the top of the hour. So thank you so much to all the subscribers who joined us. Please do let us know what you thought of this. We're going to do more. We're going to focus future events just on subscribers. So we want to do the kinds of events you're interested. We're not doing these events for the great unwashed masses out there. We're doing them for you. So thank you for joining us. Give us your feedback.
Let us know who you want us to talk to.
Yeah.
Let us know who you want us to bring on. Let us know what topics you really feel like you want us to address. We have some real assets, as you. I mean, Lizzie has really. She's forgotten more about elite politics in China than Jeremy and I will ever know put together. So it's fantastic to be able to bring her on.
Too generous of you, Kaiser.
Okay, let's wrap this up before Kaiser gets too sentimental. Thank you, everybody. We will see you soon.
All right, see you soon.